So good morning, everyone. I'm Shamika Ravi with the ORF. I'm an economist, so we'll change the tone and tenor of the conversation a little bit because I really am looking, as are many others, watching these dialogues closely. We need some ideas now and specific ideas that we can take ahead. Now, clearly, the opportunities are looming large, and that is very clear from not just the air within the room, but the general tone and tenor of the media, which has been covering India's interaction with the Gulf country. In fact, it's an ongoing research agenda at ORF, where we watch media tone, global media tone, that covers India's relations with the Gulf countries, and it has been improving and very systematically over the last several years. So on the whole, great direction. But let's start off with talking about two things in specific. And Pankaj, if I may come to you first, and let's start with two specific ideas that you think should be the next steps in terms of meeting these wider opportunities. What more and how soon?
Okay, so two very distinct kind of areas that we look at. One is this whole trend of greening energy. India will have to, if India wants to be the exporter of commodities and export or of goods and manufacturing items, then harnessing green energy is going to be essential to India. Whilst you are able to do a lot of solar, and I believe that India has harnessed more alternative energy last year than conventional energy or coal-based energy, which is fantastic. And that trend will continue. But you will still need to harness a lot more in terms of green fuel, whether it's gas, whether it's the import of your coal. We'll have to probably stabilize and not increase more and start harnessing that. For that, if we can work together, and technology is something that is still not 100% commercially proven in terms of the electrolysis of the green hydrogen and ammonia, and then coming down, you're still importing 17% of your urea fertilizer into India is still imported. And until 3 years ago, your cheapest source of urea import was Oman, with a joint venture you had done in Oman 17 years ago. So the Oman India Fertilizer Company was probably one of the largest and the cheapest source of fertilizer imports into India. Are there certain other commodities of that sort that India can harness out of the joint relationships that we have? India's ability to harness green wind energy is going to be limited only to the fact that will you be able to give out the parcels of land where land is in such a finite source and such an expensive source in India? Will you be able to kind of do that more often unless you go out to sea? Right. And that is if the admirals allow that to happen, like you did with the ONGC. So I think this is something that you need to look at. One. Number two, I was in Delhi 3 months ago and we talked about a very interesting project, and that is if we can set out communication cables and going around the world through undersea, what's stopping you from energizing Europe through electric cables running through the seas and through land across into the Mediterranean? Can you harness wind and solar energy in India, solar landing it in Oman, connecting with Oman or the Middle East ability to harness wind and solar, and putting it on the cable across the thing? A future. This is what I think the Indian Prime Minister had, actually it was his idea, saying, can we electrify the world? Just a thought.
Saffron revolution. The Prime Minister constantly talks about. And one thing to bear in mind is we import 34% of our energy used. So energy security is one of our leading concerns today. Admiral Luthra, if I may come to you, what in your view would be the immediate opportunities that we can try and attain together?
Yes, one is of course the overall economic and trade partnership. you see, both the GCC and India have shown good resilience and good rebound from COVID. And GCC this year as a group is expected to grow at about 5.9%, and India 7 to 7.5%. But this is, and both have sort of bucked the trend globally. I mean, the global trend is in front of us, the global fragility is in front of us, the economic challenges that the world is facing in front of, but these two economies are bucking the trend. But that trend, bucking that trend is something we cannot take for granted, because these difficulties and these challenges are still around us and will perhaps remain around us for quite a while. So therefore, the scope for the trade at present, we are looking at a trade of currently at about $154 billion bilateral trade with the GCC as a whole. And while specific targets have been set with the UAE through the agreement that has been signed, of just with UAE reaching 100 billion, but with GCC, with all countries of GCC, I think there is tremendous scope to improve this, to almost double it and make it less. And the trade figures till now have been also dependent upon the price of oil. Annual trade values have varied because of the price of oil. To make it independent of that, and number of areas which are already under discussion, whether in I2U2 or in CEPA, those need to be brought under the entire GCC umbrella. And the second part is, I think you mentioned energy in the end. From energy security point of view, for both, for us as a consumer and for GCC as a supplier, there are many areas to work together on energy transition, because energy transition is going to be very challenging. It's not simple. The energy markets are changing, constantly changing. From Asia, they're changing back to Europe now. The energy transition and the GCC assessment is that conventional energy will continue to increase in size, volume, everything for next 15 to 20 years. 2045 is what the GCC feels, before the arrangements of climate change kick in and the conventional energy sources start coming down. So despite the fact that investments in oil and gas have come down by more than 50% since 2014, but the overall growth in this sector is going to continue, and therefore there is a need for working on energy transition strategy. And India as a growing and increasing consumer and a market, and working, and while they have, GCC has done diversification in energy and energy intensive sectors, but this overall strategy for transition is something I think India and GCC can work together.
Great. Adil, if I may come to you.
Yes. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think I would tackle it from a little bit different aspect of taking this relationship to the next level. The Indian is important from GCC exporting the energy, while the GCC countries focus on exporting food. I think those two issues are interrelated with the technology aspect and also the climate change aspect as well. My colleague here already mentioned about cooperating with the climate change. I think I want to highlight that the COP28 coming up next year in UAE, I think this would provide an opportunity for the Indian and GCC to collaborate more, especially in areas where they can do the climate change cost, fair distributions, and making the developed countries probably taking the higher burden in that. The other area is distributing the fund wealth in the COP28 to the non-developed countries and to the other countries. However, probably the biggest highlight point is the technology aspect, which is the Indian, in fact, exporting about 11% of their technology to the GCC. And I think if we have a reciprocal investment between the GCC country, the wealth countries, also from the Indian, and this technology field would in fact benefit all of us. For example, Mubadala has invested $1.6 billion on telecommunication and also digital security environment. If we expand those investment from the organizations that are wealth from the GCC to the Indian, and as well as the Indian companies and the technology should also be ready to export and to open and use the opportunity that is provided by GCC in terms of business and the environment of investment in the GCC for the technology companies to open up there. And I think those are the two emergent, maybe an immediate areas of cooperation in the future in terms of crisis. I mean the energy, renewable energy issues, and also the high technology transferring into the GCCs.
Great.
Yes, thank you.
If I may come to you, Sultan.
Yes, thank you very much. If I may, at the beginning, just clarify, I'm no longer associated with the Doha Institute. So what I say represents my own view. I'm now with Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar.
A bit louder, please.
I think the challenge is greater than just thinking of economic opportunities. Earlier this morning, we heard about what opportunities exist, and there are a lot of it. Last year in particular, almost doubled in terms of economic trade between India and the Gulf. I think there is an added layer that we must consider if we are going to have sustainable cooperation, collaboration, and really, as our speaker said in the morning, have a stamp on the world, to actually bring the focus, the center of the development to this region and play a role that was played 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago. And part of the answer of that, I think, is to go back to our values. We both, the Gulf, the Arabian world, the India, have incredible set of values that have governed our relationship man to man and man to nature that have we ignored. We have ignored, maybe at our personal level, we still observe it. Everyone in their family, they set the limits. We understand our relationship to nature. We understand the limit of how far you can push nature, how far you can push your neighbor, how far you relate. All of this in our individual lives, we do. As nations, we don't. And I think the result of that is that we started to see cracks within nations. India is one, Gulf is one. We have problems, we have social issues that have to be addressed, I think, by going back to our set of values. And the same applies for our future development opportunities. We continuously keep looking to the West. Now we look to the West as a potential market for energy. But of course, they will drop us as fast as they picked us up if there is an alternative and cheaper avenue for gas to come back, either restored from Russia or to be driven from the United States to Russia. The region will not be a priority. So we really need to think in terms of our values, go back to basics, create an opportunity that is only feasible for this region, really. It builds on our strength. And very important part of that is to define the limits. And this is what Western development have failed to do. They've not defined the limit of exploitation economically at the cost of culture and human and nature. And this is why we are now having to react to all this, the COVID-19, environmental disasters, et cetera, et cetera. But these things were set 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, 1,400 in the case of Islam. We need to go back to the basics, study those, and then choose opportunities that suit our values. And part of this, I come to the issue of now everybody is excited about Israel and the relationship with the Gulf and India and so on. Again, I think if you don't take the value scale to that, this relationship is not going to be sustainable. Any alliance that's built on security is the alliance of the weak, is the alliance of the threatened. You need an alliance that is built on opportunity of the strong, of the determined, of the full-minded, and we need to go back to really hold people accountable to their acts. So human rights abuses are not acceptable anywhere, And these are part of our original value. We should be able to advocate it and reflect it in our relationship with everybody. So you turn a blind eye to occupation in one part of the world because there is a strategic relationship, cheaper weapon, cheaper technology today. It will haunt you later. So we have to be very clear, I think, and there's a great opportunity in the Arabian Sea. Just as our speaker said in the morning, this is a unique region, 1/3 potentially of the world population. Well, let's make it work, but let's make it work based on those basic values as well. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Babu, if I may come to you next.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I'm grateful for the invitation. I will start with a little anecdote. I came here when I was a young man in the 70s, in the late 70s, and I was with my great grandfather, who was ill, and he came for medical tests in Mumbai. And we went for a walk, gate of India, and he stood there, and he held my hand. He was an elderly man, and he said, "You know, son, this is where your great-grandfather's ship sank when we were trading with India." And I went there the other day just to watch. I came here a few days earlier, just to go to the same spot and remember my great-grandfather. I think this anecdote kind of tells us something, that trade and relations between the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula, and India has been going on for centuries, as has been eloquently described by speakers before. But something has happened that has actually changed the norm and disrupted all of this relationship. We have to remember that, you know, geography is a king in this, and when we're talking about this, you know, we are neighbors at the end of the day. We have a very narrow stretch of water that separates us. But we also have a lot of common ideas and values, as has been explained by my colleague here. So what are the things we should do? I think what I would start by saying is that we need a paradigm shift. We need the paradigm shift in the way that we think about the relationship. The relationship has not progressed the way that it has should have been. There is a lot of potential, but we lost that. Both of us lost it. And mistakes were made from both sides as well. You looked east, we looked west, and you know, we diverged and lost opportunities, and now we are coming back to talk about it. I can tell you that as an academic, and also I used to be a businessman, we went to the West to attend conferences, workshops, etc. And we went to Far East to attend conferences, workshops, etc. and discuss relations between the Gulf, Asia, and so on, the Arab world. But this is the first time I get invited to a conference in India, believe it or not, and this is the closest to us. So I'm sure this is also goes for many of my colleagues here. So I think there is something missing, and it's something that you know, goes back to that we need to rethink, and we need this paradigm shift in the way we look at things. Obviously, there are some low-hanging fruits that we can do, and it's been mentioned by my colleagues, so I don't need to repeat them. And that is basically, you know, trade, investments, human relations, etc. But I think it's more than that. I think there's been a divergence of views between India and the Gulf. And I think this divergence is deeper than what we think. We took things for granted, that there are maybe some official visits, some naval exercises, some trade that goes on. That is normal. But that is not the potential that this relationship should produce. And that is something that we need to think of, is thinking about the future. We have lost a lot of opportunities. Even the people that we have living in the Middle East or in the Gulf that came from India, they are now being slowly replaced by other nations as well. You know, India is not the only country that supply us with human resources. Obviously, the Indian human resources played a very, very important part in the development in the Gulf. We're grateful for that. But things are changing. Investment opportunities are being produced somewhere else and not in India, unfortunately, for your own domestic reasons, to a certain extent. And I don't want to go on for too long, but I just want to end up with what my colleagues just lastly mentioned. We have to be careful. India has been perceived in the region as a country that has tried to keep good relationship with everybody, with all conflicting parties, whether it is Iran, Israel, Iraq, Gulf states, other Arab states, etc. Now it's throwing its weight in one direction. I think we need to rethink about that. Is this going to improve the relations, or is it going to be something that we are going to live to regret? And I will end with that. Thank you.
Now in fact, I had thought that we would talk about the opportunities first and then talk about perhaps two big challenges. But somewhere while we started with the opportunities, we really did organically move towards the challenges. But I think that's symptomatic of what has happened to the relationship. One thing very clear in not only the keynote addresses, but in each of your remarks, is an angst of something lost. And I think there in itself lies perhaps an opportunity to build on, because we clearly had something strong and solid, and there is a will or a wistfulness to move towards that direction. Now, energy and technology are obviously the two. Well, nothing is a low-hanging fruit anymore in today's global economy. But clearly, these are two directions in which I think we can move more quickly. The food security is something we haven't talked much about, and yet it is one of the biggest challenges for the Gulf region as well as for India. Now, to people in the room and to the general audience outside as well, India is now in a situation, only now, after 75 years, where we are now food secure. In the sense, our overall import of food is now down to a very minuscule, 1 or 2%, and that too, it is of super processed and so on and so forth. So in terms of food security, our dependence on imports has fallen because the production, the food production has risen a great deal lately. But what more can we do with the region, Pankaj? Because this is something you talked about in your opening remarks at the keynote, that this is something that we could build on more solidly.
I think we've looked at doing contract farming. We've looked at, in order for Middle East to be food secure, we're not a very populous and a very highly density populated area, but we do consume a lot more than the average Indian consumes for whatever reasons, good and bad. Right. Our intake is a net import of both the greens and the grains. I think what needs to happen is there a way that we can use our parched lands? Is there a way that we can cultivate in those lands? And Saudi Arabia tried to do it many years ago, to have large vasts of desert into wheat farms. Whilst it was possible, but how economical was it? And at what expense of the aquafilter water that was being pumped out at rates which were of great. Now, can we use desalination? Can we use aqua farming? Aqua farming will not give you grain, it'll give you greens. You know, what are the things? So I think research, technology, biotechnology is something that is definitely required. Another area that we need to look at in terms of going forward is also what are we doing in terms of harnessing the high energy costs for producing finished goods, whether it's metals, alloys for the auto and communication industry. Are you still able to do it economically and competitively in India if you have to pay your 12 and 15 rupees per kilowatt hour electricity when the same electricity in the Gulf is available at 50%, if not 40% of the cost that you are selling it at over here? I mean, we are that far, not far away, but that close. We're not separated by waters, we are joined by the water. Can we look at the possibility of putting an economic thing whereby high energy consuming manufacturing can take place? Can we become a single custom union at some point in time? I know UAE has paved the way for that. Congratulations. But can the rest of us do it as well, where we look at energy efficiency being available or energy efficient manufacturing taking place in this part, and you do the grain for us?
And again, technology being the key.
Yeah, I mean, you know, do we have food security and energy security? Can we both have a bilateral relationship in whereby we say we will do the energy transition for you, and if you can help us transit from a food security point of view?
Sure.
Thank you.
Admiral Luthra?
Food security, you see, in the entire GCC region, it imports about 85% of its food requirements, all different types. It varies between fresh vegetables to meats and but overall it's 85%, and it's going to remain very high. Now, between, and India, as you mentioned now, is a major player in the global food chains. But even in the food industry, India is trying to improve its global value chain index, because there it's still low. And a number of technologies are required for that, including in food processing, in storage, warehousing, transportation, and in biotechnology, which was mentioned. So these now have been both CEPA and I2U2 capture the requirement of food security and have incorporated that. Now, how much of more farming, etc., in the Gulf area, what sort of efficiencies can be increased? It's been under discussion for many years. But broadly, the setting up of these food corridor, which is a pilot project right now, which has already been is being implemented. This, I think, will be a very important pilot, where under I2U2 this food corridor is being set up, wherein finance is coming in from UAE, some technology is coming in from Israel and the US, and it is the main production part is happening in India. So therefore, this food corridor as a pilot, the success of this pilot is extremely important, and therefore similar corridors, diverse corridors will be very helpful in improving food security between these two countries.
Excellent. Adil?
Yes, as they always say, when there is a will, there is a way. I think the I2U2 is a partnership that is tackling a very critical crisis of the world in the food area. So this was not possible, in fact, to create. The objective is to create a powerhouse for food within the region, from India to the Gulf, especially based in India. I think this was perhaps not possible without partnership. And in order to get the partnership, one key element, maybe a key value, is to be tolerance and to learn how to coexist. Tolerance is something that you have to have the will to accept others. Whether it is not necessarily that you believe in their behavior, you agree in their behavior, you agree in their religions, but in fact, you should learn how to accept others. And then you will create a partner. What we believe in the partnership is, as His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed says, the ruler of UAE said, when you have a partnership, you can overcome any overlapping challenges. And when you have a partnership with tolerance and coexistence, you will definitely have a security, and then economical prosperity is the next. The Abraham Accord has, in fact, between UAE and Bahrain and the Israelis, has also infected other nations to have a diplomatic relationship with Israel, such as Sudan, like 72 days after that. But most important, it has improved and in the trade and also investment in the business, not only with the GCC, but also with the countries. And that was not possible maybe a decade ago, but was possible today. The things are moving and evolving towards prosperity and towards achieving the better of not only the region, not only the GCC, but the entire region, perhaps the world. And I think the ITU2 is the pilot for food security. I think, the success of ITU2, not only the food, but I also emphasize in the energy and climate change as well. So when that pilot things are successful, I think we can build on it towards that perspective. But I do believe a key value is tolerance and coexistence that we need to learn among us. Yeah. Thank you.
So where there's a will, there's a way.
Yep.
Dr. Barkat, do you think the values and the will, the combined will, can overcome the challenges that are obviously also looming, as yourself and as well as Professor Babu did talk about?
Well, I think relying only on economic logic and driven by cheap technology will provide you an answer for today, possibly for tomorrow, but it will not be sustainable, and it will not really help you close the social gap. I go back, that exists within India, exists within the Gulf, and exists between India and the Gulf. So it's not on its own, it's not sufficient really. And I appreciate the chosen definition of partnership, relation with Israel, etc. But that is not going to help us to be food secure on its own. Part of the problem was pointed out by my colleague earlier. Our pattern of consumption is unacceptable. It's too far. I mean, it has resulted in the highest level of diabetes anywhere in the world. So we need to look deep into our existence. What is it we do? Our diet, none of it is generated locally, very little. Rice, I don't know when rice was introduced to the Middle East, but it's now a basic component of what we eat. None of us has the water to create it. Pasta, whole of East Africa, Horn of Africa, reliant on pasta. That was brought by the Italians. So it's all good to do all these opportunities, economic, but if we don't really challenge ourselves fundamentally, I don't think it's going to be sustainable. And it's certainly not going to create the change that we know we can do because we've done it before. And we know now as a region, there are many, many possibilities to short connections, culture, language. I don't know how many million Indians live in the Gulf, but I suspect quite larger than some of the population of some countries in the Gulf.
8 to 9 million.
8 to 9 million, here you are.
8 to 9.
It's almost a state. So
8 to 9 million.
that, I think, if we are going to be really, really serious about this cooperation, we have to be tolerant about limits of sovereignty, okay? And allow ourselves to think collaboratively about each other's problems and our common problem. Maybe move away from international to transnational cooperation, where we open the possibilities for our academic institutions, universities, research centers, think tanks to engage and think, and allow them the freedom to do that engagement. As long as we are limiting the freedom, and I'm not saying any one country is guilty of this, we have limited creativity. So the middle theme of our talk today is not there, really. I mean, what I'm saying is we need to limit the possibilities of consumption, but not the possibilities of imagination, of thinking. And this can happen, I think. They're amazing brain power. I mean, if you look at, I often do this exercise, you look at the United States of America or Europe, and the top scientists, they all come from this region. There are a lot of very successful individuals there, and the reason they were able to succeed there is because they've had the freedom to engage and to develop their ideas and so on. So I'm all for tolerance, but it has to be, there has to be a principle on tolerance of what? We can tolerate, there's a limit to what you can tolerate, and it is good for everyone to know that limit. The moment we throw all of this behind our backs and say, well, we're only hungry, we want to feed ourselves. We're only insecure, we want to secure ourselves. We become more hungry, we're going to become more insecure. Bringing Israel to the Gulf has irritated Iran. So the risk of insecurity has raised, not dropped. And our experience, they will not come to your rescue when you really need them. They have not come to the rescue of the United States when it really needed them in the Gulf. It was the American soldiers who died, not the Israelis, that the United States has sponsored and continues to sponsor to the margin of $3.5 billion a year. So we have to be realistic and judge by our history and our values.
Now, as far as the behavioral changes are concerned, when you say that we have to change our patterns of consumption, let it also be, again, something point of noting that one of the major initiatives within the government of India, for instance, right, driven through Niti Aayog, is looking, in order to meet the climate concerns, various variables. But one of the parameters which is being very seriously considered are behavioral changes in our consumption patterns. Because this is something the Prime Minister repeatedly talked about, but now it has been seeded. The ideas are being basically, we are inviting ideas from across the country. But that really mimics, I mean, it reflects exactly what you mentioned. And at the end, can I come to you, Professor, for your very thoughtful comment on food security? Is it a concern, and do you think we can overcome our differences to look at this one grave common concern?
Thank you very much. It's always a challenge to speak after such a distinguished panel and with so many interesting ideas. So I think they've covered it well. I just want, if I may add something to that, is that when we look at the food security, we should not look at it in isolation. Food security is part of a nexus of water security and energy security, climate change, and you cannot isolate them from each other. And obviously, it also all at the end boils down to, of course, behavioral sciences or behavioral issues, but also to politics. So it's all very interconnected. Food security is a challenge for everybody, for humanity at large. And India has done quite well in this regard, but for obvious reasons, the Arabian Sea countries have not, especially the Arab countries, have not been doing as well because of lack of water and rain. This is maybe changing with the climate change, we don't know. But any challenge, whether it is food security, whether it is water security, energy security, can be elevated or it can be controlled, or it can be helped by science and behavioral change. And I think science is developing, and there is a lot of agriculture sciences that are taking place around the world that we could benefit from, and we could grow things in the Gulf, especially nowadays, with all the technology that is there. Can India play a major role there? Yes, of course. India is, of course, a major supplier of food for the Gulf, and will continue to be for, as I mentioned earlier, geographical proximity. But also because of the nature of India. But India also faces its own problems, and that is water security. So there is a lot that we can do there together, to work towards improving this, and obviously looking at climate change and energy security in the process. And I think I2U2 has given these issues quite an important role. Basically, it's focusing on energy security, water security, energy security, food security, etc. And obviously, there is a lot of Israeli technology that one can use in that regard. However, this takes us back to this idea, is that the Abraham Accord is, of course, something that is, it's happening. It's not being signed by certain countries, and it has faltered to a certain extent. There is a lot of pressure to get all other countries to go for it, but it hasn't worked. And therefore, I2U2 has been invented as another lifeline to the Abraham Accord. And I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think, although there are people are talking about S2 now, and that is adding I2U2, I think S2 to I2U2, and that is South Korea and Singapore. But this minilateralism is something that is still being tried and tested. But I can tell you, someone who comes from the region, it's not that the region does not want to work with Israel and use Israeli technology and know-how. It's to the opposite. The region wants to work with Israel, wants to have peace with Israel. There is an Arab peace initiative that's been there, and now it's being revived, by the way. But it is Israel that is not accepting to live in its region, and they're not accepting to give, to either do a two-state solution or one-state solution. And it wants to be an apartheid state, which is not acceptable. And this is where, in principle, we cannot have relationship with any country that wants to have a relationship with in the region. It's their prerogative. It's their, sovereign decision, and we respect that. But not all the Arab countries are going to do that, and this is creating a problem and creating a schism in the area. And having India getting involved in this, it also can create a bit of an issue in this relationship. So yes, there are potential for everybody in the region to work together. India, Iran, Israel, Iraq, Turkey, everybody to work together. But there are certain principles that we have to accept. And at the moment, Arab countries, at least many of them, are not accepting to work with Israel until there is a resolution to this main conflict, which is a Palestinian issue. And it's on the table. Two-state solution or one-state solution, choose. But Israel doesn't want to do that, and it wants to have an apartheid state. And this is where, someone like me, I question why India wants to get involved in this and take a side when, this movement or this process has no clear view or clear vision, and we don't know where it's going to go. Does it want to wreck its relationship with the rest of the Arab world because of very low-hanging fruit, getting Israeli technology and UAE investment into India? Or is it looking for the wider interest? These are something that we need to think about. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm thinking these questions are arising, and we should think about them seriously.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for your very interesting comments. It would be very unfair if I didn't take questions. Perhaps we have only 2 minutes, so if we can take some questions from the audience, please. Yes. Very, very candid comments, and exactly this is the reason why we have to talk outside of the government. This is where ideas come from. Yes, please.
Great moderation.
Thank you for the panel. Very candid discussion. I'm Sudhir Bhatia.
largest liquid markets now globally. Just to give you a sense, if you look at any time interval.
And try and make it quick, please. We're running out of time, yes.
Hello. Yeah, it's working. The Indian markets continue to outperform. What I definitely see is that we see no presence of Gulf investors in India. And India is the only country which will see population growth. China will see population decline. Europe will see population decline. But we don't see that. I think that's primarily because most investments are centralized. We don't see the rise of any Indian professional in Gulf entities which can take senior decisions, while we see Canadian, Australian, American firms clearly empower their staff, Indian staff, to take decisions in India, and have long legacies of doing business and investing very profitably in India. So I think that it definitely calls for a lot of reflection on how organizational cultures are shaped in the Gulf. It's also part of the process of not allowing any naturalization, which happens when even highly educated individuals don't get opportunities to rise in the elite of the Gulf. So maybe you may want to talk about it.
Okay, that's more of a question. Well, comment. Thank you. Anyone else? So we have one hand, and then we'll cap it right there. We're over time. Now, that wasn't a question, but if there is a counter comment, you're welcome. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Stalin. I'm UN Secretary in Government of India. My question is to Mr. Professor Abdullah Mahmood. In your concluding remark, you mentioned about India is perceived to be seen as a country that is throwing its weight in one particular direction, which needs to be guarded carefully. And I guess you also mentioned in your next remarks saying that India is getting involved in Israeli-Arab conflict and is taking sides. Your concluding remark only aimed at Arab-Israeli conflict, or is there anything more to it?
Okay, he's reading into your comments. So would you like? He's saying, is your comment only about the Israel conflict, or is there a deeper and a comment beyond Israel?
No,
Yes, please. Yes,
my comment was that India has played a very, very careful role throughout its history. You know, the region is plagued by conflicts. I don't need to tell you how many conflicts there are, and there will continue to be. And India has been very clever and smart in having good relationship with everybody and keeping a distance from everyone and working with everyone. And that is absolutely accepted. But it seems now there has been a change of heart. You know, maybe it is because of international geopolitics, bringing China into this equation, if you like, and its role in the Middle East, in the Gulf, etc. And maybe there is some US pressure. We don't know. Maybe India sees an opportunity there. I don't know. But you know, the globe is going through a transition at the moment. People talking about, you know, receding US power, China, ascendance of China, etc., etc. Maybe, you know, we don't know what's going to happen to Russia with the war. And there is also a lot of changes that are happening in the region. And there is a lot of configuration and alliances are building up. The picture is not clear. For India to throw its weight on this direction is a bit of a question mark. Is it going to be helpful to its relationship with the Middle East? Or is it going to harm? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. But I have a question. And I'm a little worried that this could really badly affect the relationship in India and how it's perceived in the region. And it is like, you know, moderating policy in the region, because it's basically throwing its weight in one camp at the moment.
Okay, Sultan, you had a comment. And we'll end with that.
But this is my own personal interpretation. I may be totally mistaken. That it has to do with the rivalry with China, a little bit. China and Israel warmed their relationship, and China now has increased its investment into Israel to billions of dollars in order to act as a bypass to Trump's restrictions on technology to China. And this has happened over the last 4 years. Now I reckon there's something to the region of $20 billion Chinese investment in Israel, simply to take the technology. And the Israelis are selling it to that price. They're happy to pass it on. It's a lot of American technology, joint technology. Israel is. So maybe India felt that they will lose the technology edge by not having a direct relationship with Israel. But if you look at this technology really carefully, a lot of it is about copyrights and very mini little stuff that India can actually develop, as China has the ability to develop as other countries. They're just restricted by the copyright system, which is an international global accepted system that Israel has led the way in. I don't think India, I mean, going back to what Gandhi did, he took off the industrialized fabric and went back to basic, and he started it again. And I think that is what the world has always looked up to India for. When India was the lead in the non-alliance, there was a real pole to look to. Now we miss that a little bit, and I think a lot of not just in the Arab world, I mean the whole third world looks at this. And I go back to the fact that it's not just about India's relationship outside, it's India's relationship within India. I mean, now we are here, but we also walked yesterday on the streets. We can see the gap. You must, in order to have that power moving forward, you must close that gap as much as possible, as fast as possible, and not just rely on fashionable ideas, quick solutions that could come from the outside. Thank you.
Last comments go to
I just wanted to make a comment on this discussion on, earlier mention was made about transnational, and ITU2 has been under discussion. Of course, a few days back, the new trilateral between India, UAE, and France, the first meeting has happened already, which is independent of Israel. And because the Indian approach, see, you cannot eliminate geopolitical overhang in any discussion, but you can minimize it. And India's approach has always been to minimize geopolitical overhang and to work on economic partnership and what may be called as development-linked cooperative security. That has been the approach. If you see, and I2U2 is very different from the Quad on the eastern side. And in this, minimization of geopolitical overhang has been an objective. You cannot eliminate it, and in perceptions it will always be there. But the broad policy, whether in the entire Indo-Pacific, if you see, India's approach, and the same approach, in fact, because India has been very neutral, as was rightly said, but India also wants to move away from passive neutrality to engagement with the region. And when you engage, and you're not only passively neutral, then it is possible that some geopolitical overhang may be seen. Yes. But India wants to minimize that geopolitical overhang and work on development-linked cooperative security. Thank you.
And never forget the fact that when you went walking and you saw the Great Divide, I think that in many ways is also a key driver for a lot of our policies. We still have an absolute poverty about 7%. And that in absolute numbers is a very large number. So many of our policies and our outlooks are also driven by the concern that we've brought out nearly 300 million people out of poverty on the back of economic growth in the last 30 years. We have to continue that momentum because we still have a significant number below the poverty line. And that for us does remain. And I think we should never lose focus of the domestic great concern that does drive a lot of our policy. Thank you all, gentlemen, for very candid comments. And I'm sure throughout the rest of the day, you're going to echo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.